Hello everyone and welcome back to the Educated Colin Snap channel. How you doing? So today we've got a really big video for you probably. I have finished the meta tier list for May. So we're going to be going over every archetype, I would say, and just trying to give you an idea of what the meta looks like. This is definitely the longest video I've made so far in terms of how much effort required. So definitely gonna decide whether I want to do another one. But before we get started, I do have a couple of things to talk about. So let's begin. So we're going to usually have two deck lists. There is maybe one archetype that is very rigid where I could only realistically have one deck for it. But generally, we'll have 2 or 3 deck lists and then some notes for it. So should be covering everything in the meta, you'll see. So before we begin, I just want to say that I'm covering a lot of archetypes and over 100 deck lists. So not everything's going to be correct. Obviously, I did do my research. I have like a whole Excel sheet of data that I parsed through to kind of get this information out. So just want to say, if you disagree with some of the stuff, obviously you're going to have different experiences from what I feel about an archetype or what the data shows. So just be aware. Now, something I did want to cover that I learned from the last tier list was that people kind of looked at the top and said, okay, those are the only ones that are playable. Everything besides like the first 2 sections are not playable, not good. And that's really not the case in how you want to look at a tier. So here I just wanted to have like my own breakdowns. These aren't exactly accurate, but it's kind of how you want to look at a deck essentially. So the tier zeros, they're going to be a little bit way above. You want to look at them like 60% win rate. They're kind of accurate, but not like fully. There's some that are outliers, and they're not always going to be exact equals in terms of what is a high win rate, what's a high cube rate. Tier 1 is like 55 to 58. Tier 2 is like 53 to 54. Tier 3, 51 to 52. So the tiers are just percentage points in terms of win rate, and percentage points in terms of how much cubes you're getting per game. So I wouldn't necessarily look at something in tier 4 and say, oh, it's unplayable. That's not really the vibe I wanted to give, and that was what I was kind of hearing from the viewers. You guys are like, oh, this thing is very low tier, it's unplayable. That's not the case. You can kind of play everything, and that's a good thing in the game, that there's a lot of flexibility in what you want to play, even though people usually will gravitate towards whatever is highest win rate, highest play rate, cube rate, whatever. That doesn't mean that the things doing or lower can't win at all. So that's something I want to stress. I definitely had that feeling that they're only going to play what's at the top. That's not true. You can play anything in the deck. The only thing I would say maybe you want to be careful of is the tier 5s. Those are sub 50% win rates. And that's like some of the best decks are giving you sub 50% win rates. And that's really not super impressive in terms of an archetype. So those are the ones maybe you want to be careful of. But everything else is definitely playable if you find it enjoyable, you find it fun. Don't let the tier stop you. Now I have a new thing where there's this little thumbs up girl, Miss Marvel. It just means that I've made a deck breakdown for that archetype. So if you were looking to learn more about an archetype and I didn't cover enough in this particular video, you can look up the deck breakdown for it there. So it's just like a quick reference. If you see it, it's usually going to be at the top left. That just means, okay, you can find a deck breakdown in the channel. So with all that, let's get started. So first thing, to get started, first one will be Jeff's Stature. I've covered a lot of this in yesterday's video. I hadn't fully done like the deck list and stuff like that in the deck, but I do have that now. So if you watch yesterday's video, you're going to know that, okay, Jeff Stature is the tier 0, the one in alone. And this is just a really powerful deck. There is not really too many weaknesses. You would say maybe the weakness is that it's super reliant on Zabu and Black Bolt Stature, right, to have those big payoffs. But there's just so much power in all the cards and a lot of flexibility in what you want to do with the Darkhawk and the Jeff and all that stuff, that you can just react to things very easily and you can play a lot of power. So it's a really nice deck. Definitely has the best stats in the game right now. And with Iron Lad, some people are just chucking that in, and it also just works very well. So I would say Steph Thatcher is the best deck right now. I wonder if they're going to do anything about any of the cards, but for now they haven't. So you can definitely feel good about this deck and a lot of it. It's just tons of good cards in the same deck, so it's no surprise it does very well. Next up, we're going to be talking about Sera. So there's a lot of Sera decks in tier 1. First one, we'll talk about Sera Darkhawk. So this one just relies on Sera and using the Darkhawk engine. So Darkhawk engine is usually Zabu, Korg, Zabu, Darkhawk, Rockslide. Black Widow's a piece, but it's kind of been left on the wayside because it only works well with Darkhawk, where some of the other pieces, rocks and stuff, are annoying in it of itself, and Darkhawk is just a really nice bomb. So you just add Sera in with the Zabu engine to get a lot of discounts on your final turn, and being able to play your Darkhawk without being worried about it being Enchantress or worried about it being Shang-Chi, since you're playing on the final turn, usually without priority, but sometimes even with priority, they have to guess where you're playing it. So it's not likely to be hit, and you just have a lot of power in the final turns to really punish people. So Sera is just a card that opens up a lot of powerful archetypes right now, and there isn't that much ramp in the metagame since the nerf, so you just get away with doing Sera strategies over and over. So definitely a very powerful archetype, one of the tier 1s here. Next up, we have Sera Hidmonkey. So this is another version of Sera. Instead of using Darkhawk, you're using Hidmonkey. Its stats are also very strong, so you don't necessarily have to use Darkhawk. You can use whatever. Even without Hidmonkey, we'll talk about that as well, are still pretty strong. So this one, you do have to control space since you're kind of relying on Hidmonkey and Mysterio to be your combo. So since that is your key engine, you do have to be careful not to flood a particular lane that you want to play Hidmonkey in the final turns. You still have the Shang-Chi Enchantress piece, which is really just a core piece of Sera engines right now, and you don't really have Zabu anymore, but you do have a lot of scaling with the Angel and the Bishop. So just a nice piece. Hidmonkey allows you to do have a nice final turn, kind of reminiscent to Darkhawk, but not using the Darkhawk engine itself. Next up, we have Sera Surfer. So this one I do have a deck breakdown for, but this once again is a Sera deck, but instead of relying on Darkhawk or Hidmonkey, you are now relying on Silver Surfer. So that is very notable in that you're running a ton of 3s and 3 drops. With Sera, discount becomes 2, so you get the flood in the final turn with your 3s. The issue or the notable thing about Surfer decks is that they don't have a ton of power associated to the cards, but they do have a ton of utility. So there's Polaris, Killmonger, Storm, Cosmo, Shadow King, Juggernaut. There's so much utility in the 3-drop engine that you don't win through having tons of power. You win through countering your opponents, and that's the main difference with this type of Surfer deck or Sera deck. You really have to be aware of what your opponents are doing and making sure that you're countering it with Surfer and the 3-drop tools that you have. So that's the main difference here. But if you can do that, this deck does have really good stats, very solid deck list, and something you can play with. So definitely think it's pretty good, pretty strong as well. And you have a lot of options for Sera decks. Next up, we are talking about is DoomWave. So Doom is generally just a pretty solid strategy, you just play wave on 5, and then you're able to usually play 2 cards on 6 while your opponent usually plays 1. So normally that's She-Hulk plus something. You can also do it with Death and have Death plus something. But with DoomWave, you're usually just doing Doom plus She-Hulk is the combo. You can also do She-Hulk plus Arrow is another strategy that people do tend to use. So here, your early game is not really as important. You have a lot of different pieces in what you want to do in the early game, whatever strategy you want to work with. The main difference is just making sure that you wave on 5 so you can play your combo on 6. So definitely a strong archetype to say. It's kind of Sandman-esque in that you're preventing your opponent on turn 6 to do all the things they want to do, right? So the issue with this is that it doesn't have a good matchup into Jeff and some other deck lists, right? Since Wave isn't too restrictive in how it prevents you from playing cards. A lot of cards can still just get discounted. If your opponent's playing Sera as well, then the Wave isn't as impactful. So that's kind of why it's not like super broken. There's a lot of cards that can just get around the wave effect. But overall, it still has a really nice matchup in a lot of different decks and can definitely do well. So next up, we have Moon Monkey. This is like the non-Sera version of Hidden Monkey decks. So usually Hidden Monkey decks are normally run with Sera, but if you don't want to run Sera and for some reason you don't have Sera, but you do have Hidden Monkey, well, then you can run Hidden Monkey with Moongrow. And now Moongrow opens up some things, usually the She-Hulk angle, right? With Moongrow, you can pass on 5, get 2 1-cost She-Hulks, and use that to flood with the Hidden Monkeys. And usually you'll have 1 or 2 Hidden Monkeys to play depending on whether you're covered with Mysterio. So you just get a really nice final turn with this combo. The second list is one I created myself, but turns out it's the best list for Moon Monkey if you're not running Sera. So I was like, hey, look at me. So, but generally the one at the top is the one that's most normally played, I would say. But definitely an interesting way of using Hidden Monkey, and I've played it. I have a gameplay video with the second list, and it definitely does well when you have the combo set up. So definitely a good list. Has good stats, pretty strong right now. A lot of the decks are really strong. It just shows you that there's not enough Sandman being played. That's my takeaway from this. That all the good decks are just last turn flood decks, right? So it normally was kept in check because Electro Sandman was really being played, but now it's not as popular since it did get nerfed and it was impactful, but it's like maybe you can take Sandman for a spin again. But here we're talking about Sera control. So this is a Sera deck without any of the fancy stuff. So you don't have Hidden Monkey, you don't have Surfer, you don't have Darkhawk in this. This is just classic Sera control. And it still does pretty well. So even without any of the fancy stuff, just a regular Sera control deck also does well. You do have to be much more focused on the control aspect of Sera, and by control I mean making sure that you're countering what your opponent wants to do. So if they're playing tons of ones, you Killmonger the right time. If you're and you make sure you don't have priority so that you can Killmonger on the final turn. If they're summoning a big card, you Shang-Chi, or if they're summoning ongoings, you Enchantress. So you do have to make sure that those work, those hit their targets. If you're just using them for tempo, well then you don't really have a secondary way to win. So you have to be definitely careful with your counter tools if you are playing this variant of the deck. With the other ones, you can kind of be more free because you're like, okay, I'm wasting my Enchantress, but I'll still just play Darkhawk or Hidden Monkey or whatever, and it doesn't matter. Here, it does matter. You have to make sure that you're getting your hits off. So that's the main difference here. You have to be a little bit more careful, but it's still a pretty powerful deck. Still has a lot of wins and ways to win if you just focus on the game plan of Sera control. Now, next up, we have Falcon Bounce. So this is a bounce deck just utilizing Beast and Falcon normally is the way it works. So you're usually just playing tons of ones and then bouncing them back into your hand and then playing the ones down again is really how you want to do it. So it definitely uses Bask and Beast. Those are like maybe the two key things. Falcon is also the um useful tool. It's not always played in bounce decks, but a lot of the times you're gonna see, if you're seeing Beast, you're seeing Falcon, you're also seeing Bass. So those are just the strategies there. And Darkhawk has been a very common addition nowadays. Most of the most played bounce decks are now just adding Darkhawk as a auto include, and since you're adding Darkhawk in there, you're also adding Korg. You're now also adding Black Widow, and then you still have the Hid Monkey, Bishop, uh, alternative win conditions. So there's just a lot of ways to do a lot of damage with this deck. I think it's really strong. I think it makes sense and very, very high rated, I would say, tier 1. So next up we have Deathwave. So this is very similar to DoomWave. And I would say almost all the Deathwave decks that are played right now are just a variation of DoomWave in my opinion. So it's kind of interesting that Deathwave used to be its own thing and DoomWave used to be its own thing, but they've now kind of just mixed together and they're like the same deck. You know, they're just wave decks running both Death piece and Doom piece. So you just wave into She-Hulk plus Death or Doom or an extra card. So it's just kind of the synergistic way of playing a wave deck, just running all the pieces together. And there's the one caveat is obviously you now have Death's weakness of armor or not being able to destroy or not having the right tools at the right time, right? If you don't get the Carnage before the Bucky, right, then it doesn't work well together. So you do have that weakness in this one where DoomWave just has generic one early game, so you're not really worried too much about having or relying on order, where with Deathwave you do rely on order a little bit. So that's maybe one of its downsides, but the upside is definitely way higher in that you can play 3 cards on the final turn if you get everything right. Death plus She-Hulk plus Doom or Error or whatever. And that can be such a huge swing to your opponents to deal with. So definitely a strong deck list. I was playing this one to climb, or a variation of this archetype to climb, and it definitely worked out for me. So do recommend it. Do think it's pretty strong. Next up we have Bast Bounce. So this is a little bit different than it's not that different to Falcon Bounce. It's just that it doesn't fully rely on Falcon. You don't need Falcon here. You kind of just rely on the Beast effect to carry you, and it does allow you to do a little bit more different types of decks where you can run like Iron Man. Where in Falcon Bounce, it's kind of hard to have the space for Iron Man. With Bask here, you're kind of okay of doing weirder things like having an Iron Man or having like Storm or whatever. You can definitely do a little bit more with Bask here. So even though they're kind of very similar decks, they do kind of play differently, I guess, and that's why there's a distinction in the archetype. So even though you might have similar cards, the way they're run are a little bit different. It would be my explanation. You could argue that, yeah, maybe not, but they're the same deck, so whatever. And I would agree with that. They're in the same tier. It's not like their win rates are too different because they're mostly the same cards anyways. So, but generally with this one, you're kind of relying more on the Bask Beast engine, where Falcon you're relying on flooding and then bringing it back with Falcon and flooding again. So that's the difference. But they use almost the same exact cards, so it's not too different in how you play them anyway. So moving on, we have M.O.D.O.K discard or M.O.D.O.K discard for the people that get triggered and always tell me, sorry, I'm too like locked in with the way I normally say it, but do have a deck breakdown for this one. But I do think this list is pretty strong right now. Even though the deck hasn't really changed, I just think the metagame has changed around it. And it's always really been fairly good and fairly robust in how much you can do and how much power you can present. When this deck works, it works super well. and it's really just gives you a lot of power on the board. So when the main drawback is that it can be kind of predictable in how much power you're going to place down. It doesn't mean they know exactly where you're going to place that power, but they know, oh, you're gonna have 16 power here and 9 power here and double swarm here, that kind of thing. So that can be awkward if your opponent is annoying and always calculating and stuff like that. But generally, the payoff is just too strong. Sometimes even if your opponent knows that you can place down 30 power this turn, they can't deal with 30 power on a single turn, so they still have to retreat or leave or so. So it's just a strong archetype and has a lot of ways to win. So I would say it's in the tier 1 discussion of very powerful decks. So next up we have Nebula Control. So this is definitely a more new arc. It's not a new archetype, but it's a new way of playing familiar archetype, the control archetype. Now you're running Nebula as another win condition. You're really fully indexing on Nebula's ability of encouraging your opponent to play in a particular lane. So you get to play Nebula, you get to play Rocket Raccoon. I'm seeing Drax being played now because of Nebula. So there's a lot of real new cards being played, and that does dictate its own archetype. So here you're just using Nebula to win a lane, and then you want to control the other lane. So either you're like Spider-Maning, Professor Xing, Gamora, whatever you're doing to win a secondary lane while relying on Nebula, usually with Storm or with some lockdown to win another lane. You are a little bit scared of Killmongers, and there's a decent amount of Killmongers being played, so you can definitely run armor there, or you can definitely try winning with some other means, or not being too invested in that lane and baiting your opponent to really work for a Nebula lane that you don't care about. So it's definitely a cool archetype, and its stats are surprisingly consistent, I would say, for such a new archetype. So definitely cool to see. You can definitely try it and see if you like this particular deck list. Now here we have Galactus. Yes, it's now tier 1. I remember the last month it was tier 3, I think, right? Something like that. Even though that doesn't mean it's a bad deck. I do think it's gotten better. Annoyingly, I would say right now, or in terms of like how it's utilized, it's pretty hard to deal with someone going Electro, Dr. Octopus, Galactus, or Wave, Galactus, Spider-Man, or whatever they want to do, right? Like it is annoying. The nice thing is you can definitely build to make this deck suck, right? You could build a counter Galactus deck and make sure that the Galactus doesn't trigger at all. And you can do that reliably if you are fighting tons of Galactus. But a lot of decks right now just auto lose to Galactus, I would say, because they're not running any counter stuff. So they're not running Cosmo, or they're not running Debris. They're not running anything that really Galactus cares about. So because of that, their stats are doing pretty well right now, and it's actually better than Thanos on average, the Galactus stats. So normally, you know, we had this whole meta game of Thanos Lockjaw being very dominant and Galactus was playing second fiddle. Now I would say the Galactus is more dominant than Thanos, and Thanos is definitely playing second fiddle right now. And Kang is just like in everything or nothing. Is it nothing and everything at the same time, especially if you know how Kang works, right? So it's hard to say, oh, there's a Kang deck or something. It's just around and being annoying. But Galactus as an archetype is I would say super strong, especially when your opponents aren't countering it. If they are countering it, right, and people don't like this deck enough to counter, it's one of the few decks that people will specifically build complete decks just to make sure that this one loses, right? So if your opponents are doing that, you're going to struggle and you're going to be like, oh, this isn't doing that well. But if your opponents aren't doing that, then there's just too many archetypes that are good that you play against that this just destroys. Any of the Sera decks, right? need to play tons of cards. So if you're limiting into one lane, right, they don't get to play tons of cards. So there's stuff like that, right, where Galactus matchups into other decks are like really good. So it just helps it kind of stand out and feel like a really oppressive force in the meta. So that's my thoughts on it anyways. Moving on, we have Darkhawk Dino. So this is just the standard Darkhawk engine. Darkhawk is a card right now that's being played in a lot of different decks, right? So you see Darkhawk everywhere, but this is where it really started. Well, not necessarily Dino variant, but this is like the evolution of Darkhawk. It used to be in its own package without Dino, but a lot of people just decided you could just easily add a Dino and a Moon Girl or some synergy Sentinel, and boom, you have a whole new win condition at the end. So this is the, I would say, full Darkhawk piece where if you just want to rely on Darkhawk and nothing else and the Dino, then you can just do it. It's reliable, strong. You have multiple late game win conditions. You can kind of be flexible. You can Shang-Chi, Enchantress, Doctor Doom, a lot of little tools to really have a good way of a good win condition. So just a strong deck. Iron Lad's really coming in as well and giving them another way of winning. So it's just a good list and will probably be a consistent piece of the meta for a long time, as long as nothing changes, I would say. Next up, we have She-Hulk. I believe this is the first tier 2. Yeah, so this is the beginning of tier 2. So this is once again, right, just a couple percentage points in terms of difference, in terms of win cube rate and things like that. But notable enough that it requires its own separation in the tier. So here we have She-Hulk Infinaut. I think this is a strong deck. It's not that popular, honestly, in terms of how many people are playing it, but it does have this huge kind of final turns where you get to play Infinaut and She-Hulk, maybe 2 She-Hulks, things like that. So you have this huge final finale with this. You do need the magic or the Psylocke so that you can pass and get this free She-Hulk and combo with some of your other cards. So it's a nice deck. It has the a nice finish to it, but it's not super popular. But when you are playing it, the stats do back up it being a very dominating deck. So pretty cool here. Next up, we probably have a surprise Wong reveal. Wong is tier 2. I remember this was like much lower before, but it's just there's definitely less Cosmo in the meta. I would say a lot of the decks that we went through don't run Cosmo at all. So you actually get to play with Wong and not feel horrible. Also, Arrow's definitely less prevalent, right? So Arrow's not really there. You don't have Cosmo, not people aren't playing Magneto or anything that really just shuts down. Enchantress is like maybe your worst bet, but it doesn't like auto lose you the game where some of the other cards would do that here. So it's playable actually, and the stats actually back it up as being a playable archetype. So you still are pretty reliant on Wong, right? If they do Enchantress you, obviously it hurts. It's not like, oh my god, it doesn't matter. You still care, but it doesn't mean that the game's over. You auto lose and things like that. So you can actually get away with playing Wong, playing Reveal, and if you have Doom, you have Wong. It's a pretty cheap deck. I would say it doesn't require too many crazy pieces, so that's another plus for it, and seems to be doing well. So, see how it works for you. If you like Wong, right? I definitely always get people talking about, oh, Wong is OP, which I don't agree with, but I do think right now it's playable and definitely high in the list of decks to play. So next up we have Thanos Junk. So this is the first of Thanos list, which is surprising because Thanos used to be like number 2, I would say, in terms of how quickly you'd see Thanos in a tier list, but it's moved down. Lockjaw really helped it a lot. And I think there's definitely just more ways to play the game now, right? That you don't have to rely on Thanos, as well as Killmonger being heavily in the meta. just kind of messes with you. So obviously there are some Thanos decks that are already playing Killmonger themselves, but if you're not doing that, you do have to be careful. But Junk does annoy your opponents enough that I think it's a pretty good tool, and I think this is the best way to play Junk right now. I do have regular Junk without Thanos in there, but it's of a lower tier. The stats are not as good as with Thanos in there, so definitely think it's a strong deck, right? Tier 2 is also very, like, all the decks are pretty strong, but it's not as, reliable as maybe some of the ones at the top. And you also have to think, as we keep going down the list, the decks become almost harder to play. Not harder to play, but like they require more things going right for you to win, right? So you have to think about your moves more, and that can be annoying. That can kind of hurt the stats if it's not easy to pilot all the time. So this is definitely one that can be hard to pilot, and you do have to work for your wins, where some other decks, like, you don't really feel like you're working for your wins. But Thanos Junk, when you feel good about it, because you know you've done well in some regards. I do have gameplay for this one, but I don't have a deck breakdown or anything like that. Thanos is definitely one of the harder, was at least at the time one of the harder archetypes to break down. I think maybe now it'll be a little bit more reasonable, but at the time I wasn't that comfortable with it. But now, you can definitely try it and see how it works. So Iron Lad's a weird one to put in terms of an archetype, because it's not really an archetype, it's just a super flexible card. But I didn't want to not have a placement for Iron Lad in terms of what it looks like it's going to be at the moment. Obviously, with Howard coming out, its win rates could change dramatically. And I do think the card is inherently problematic in some ways. Like, its base power for what it does is too much. With some of the other synergies, like the Brood synergy with Iron Lad is like ridiculous. And things like Dr. Doom, right? You easily get over, 15, over 12 power with a 4 generally 3 power card or 3 energy card. So that kind of thing is a little bit questionable, but overall the stats don't really agree that this is like a Omega broken card. Actually, the stats don't they don't say, oh, this is standing out, right? It would be a tier 2 if you kind of looked at all the stats for Iron Lad right now. Obviously, it's too early to really know, and we haven't really seen an optimized Iron Lad archetype right now, and we don't even have Howard the Duck as well, right? So there's so many caveats here, but I just wanted to put this in just to kind of showcase, like, this is where Iron Lad would be if I were to put it in, make an archetype of it and put it in the tier list. It'd actually be a tier 2, which is not bad. That's not bad at all. It's just not in OP territory or tier 0, right? Which is what people are kind of talking about, right? It's not a consistent card, right? You can't guarantee it's going to hit exactly what you want. Now, it is swingy. It's extremely swingy in that when you're doing well with Iron Lad, you can't really beat it because it's too early when you win, right? So let's say you turn 3, you play Zaburan 2, turn 3, you play Iron Lad. Iron Lad hits your Dr. Doom. So boom, you've got a Dr. Doom proc. Or Galactus or Mr. Negative or whatever, or even Darkhawk, right? Like, turn 3, you've got this proc, and you're now so ahead for the rest of the game, right? Unless they do some, like, let's say you hit Iron Man or something, right? And then they Enchantress you, right? Like, you're still in a great spot. So that's kind of the problem with the card. It's just too good when it works. So when it doesn't work, it's like whatever, but when it does work, it's really strong, and that's kind of my issue with it. So I would adjust something, right? Whether it's the power or the energy cost, right? To make it feel like you have some ways to deal with it. But right now there's not, you don't really get that feeling, I think. So that's why I would cause it. But in terms of consistency, it's not really there. Maybe with Howard it would change. But let's move on. This is not Iron Lad video, but it is a decent card that will get better as decks are more made for it. Now next up we have Storm Control. So this is really just relying on Storm and Jessica Jones. It's a pretty cheap archetype, but it's actually very reliable and very strong, it seems. So if you can just go Storm into Jones into something into Doctor Doom, right? Like it's very easy to win that Storm lane, and then also just making sure that you're contesting the other lanes either through control tools or just with good early game or mid game or so, whatever you're using. So it actually turns out this is a pretty powerful deck, especially one you can use if you don't have tons of the other expensive cards, because everyone starts with Storm and Jones, Jessica Jones, and then you really just need like Doctor Doom. Captain Marvel could be Vision, so that one's not really that restrictive as well. So you actually have a lot of ways to play this pretty early in your cycle of the meta game. So pretty good deck it seems, and I've definitely played against it. It's definitely annoying to play into. So here you have Patriot. I do have a deck breakdown for Patriot. So Patriot's just a solid deck. It's always in the meta, always does decently well, and it still does well. Iron Lad also seems to be able to help Patriot. I think, especially with the Mr. Sinister Brood synergies, Iron Lad is another tool that you can do. You can play in it. But it's overall just you go Patriot and something into Ultron, and Ultron really wants to be that finisher for you, and it just does well. It's good stats, not broken. It's definitely, it doesn't have a huge ceiling, but its floor is really good. So that's why it's up in here, and definitely a solid archetype to play. So next up we have Hela Casino. Now this is in tier 2, which some could argue that it's too let me see, RNG, not, or inconsistent, that's the word, right? Too inconsistent to be in tier 2. But when it does work, it works well, right? When you can get the Hela off, you mostly win. So as long as you can set up to have a really good Hela turn, you're kind of guaranteeing your wins, and it means that you're not too worried about what your opponent's doing, because as long as you're doing what you want, it doesn't matter what your opponent does, because you're putting out too much power, and that can be just a very strong, it seems. And as long as you're able to set it up, there's definitely different ways of playing, making sure that you have the best chance of hitting Hela, and you do have like Ghost Rider to give you another shot sometimes, so it's not always that bad for you. But it seems that the stats are saying that even though it's sometimes inconsistent, if you can pilot it well, right? So it might be pilot difference. It's not a bad deck to play. So I have it up in tier 2. And I definitely think it's something you can play if you like this type of play style. It's actually one of my decks that I like to play personally. And I can understand, maybe there's a bit of bias here, but I can understand why the stats are saying, oh, it's not that bad if you can play it well. So I like it. Next up, we have Cerebro 2. So yes, I have Cerebro 2 in tier 2 as well. So this is maybe something I messed up last time in terms of I put Cerebro 2 and Cerebro 3 together, and I just said, oh, they're both inconsistent or weak to the meta. They were weak to the meta, to be fair, because of Shuri, but Shuri's gone now, right? Or mostly gone. So you don't really see Red Skulls anymore. So it's a lot easier it's easy to just say, oh, it's still going to perform badly. But when I looked at the stats, no, Cerebro 2 actually was not bad in terms of surprising me. I was like, oh, wow, I actually thought its stats would be a lot worse, but it was actually just very competitive in its tier. So you're able to flood with it. You have a lot of good power. You have a lot of annoying cards that you can play, like Goose and Scorpion, Korg are all annoying. So you definitely just get a nice stable amount of power, and then as long as you can get that Cerebro Mystique combo down, or at least one of them down, you can definitely contest multiple lanes. So Apparently, this is the most reliable Cerebro variant at the moment. Cerebro 2 and 3 are the only ones that have enough of a presence to warrant an archetype discussion, but Cerebro 2 actually hits pretty high in the list and goes up to tier 2, so pretty cool for it. All the Cerebro lovers, you can rejoice. You can say, see, I told you, it's not that bad. It's not. Next up, we have Psylocke Sera. So this one, there was only realistically one deck for it, I would say. So this one is a deck I have a gameplay of, where you're really going Psylocke into Sera, and then Sera you can go wave after the Sera to play double 6-drops on the final turn. You can also do something like wave into Odin, I believe, or something like that. Wave into Odin into Sera. I don't remember exactly what it is, but something like that. Or wave into Sera into Odin. Something like that. Yeah. I think that's right. Wave into Sera into Odin into double 6-drops. So you can find a way to get 2 6-drops out, and you have the Yondu and the Killmonger to try to get more procs for your death. So that's usually the strategy here. It's pretty good when it works. You can definitely climb with it. Has a lot of good tools for you. So solid deck list to play. And next up, we have Bastriot. So it's a Patriot version where instead of going full Patriot, you're now using Bast to be your flexible win condition. It does rely on Bast a little bit more than some of the other cards, so you do need that. But you can create lots of big swings, especially with Valkyrie and Iron Man in your toolbox, right? There's a lot of ways to just generate a ton of power. You have the Bast into Mysterio, Bast into whatever, into the Hood. A lot of little swings you can do. So pretty cool deck list. I haven't really played it myself, but it always looks fun when my opponent does. So I'm like, oh, this is cool. So definitely an interesting deck, and seems to work out according to the stats and according to what I've seen so far. So pretty interesting one. Next up, we have Molt move. So you don't actually. This isn't necessarily Molt move. You could also call this like Magneto move, I would say, but it's just a move deck with tech cards. And I would say, anytime I see the list, Molt is always the one associated with it. So I'm just giving it to him here. But it's just a tech deck a tech move deck essentially. And seems to do well. So I had to make a distinction because regular move stats are pretty bad. Like, they're not good. But this tech move stats is actually a lot better than the regular move. So I just made the decision to split them and say, okay, tech deck is playable if you want to play move. And regular move is not as good. You have to be a little bit more fancy with regular move if you want to do it well. If you're just playing Heimdall every time on 6, you're probably going to struggle. So that's really the takeaway there. I do think move is getting a ton of good cards in the future. So I definitely think move is going to climb up in the rankings and archetype if I do more of this. So there is hope for move. I honestly believe move is going to be viable and playable and maybe even oppressive. Maybe that one is more speculation than anything, but I do think there is going to be a time where people are going to be talking about move and maybe even complaining about move. So tech move, I think, is very viable right now. Next up, we have Shuri. So Shuri did get nerfed, and it used to be the best deck in the game. Now it's definitely not the best deck. There's weaknesses now. Armor isn't as good, and you're not really super reliant on just being carried by Red Skull into Taskmaster. You actually have to put in some effort now, but it's definitely not horrible. I just think people are tired of Shuri. I think maybe as time passes, people will be more open to playing more Shuri, but right now its stats aren't horrible. It's just that it's not being played essentially. So, if you want to go back to your tried and true, you can definitely try it and see how it works for you. So you just have to be a little bit more creative as well. Sometimes maybe Vision or Marvel is the way to go instead. But and Sauron also. Sauron's Shuri is also very, very strong. Like that one hasn't really changed too much, where it allows you to just play Typhoid Mary and Red Skull and Ebony Maw for free. So that one is still pretty powerful. So if you want to try a Shuri deck, the Sauron variant is better than the regular Shuri, but not everyone has Sauron, so I can't really super recommend it. But tier 2 has good stats. Definitely a strong archetype if you still want to play that type of thing. Now here we have Nimrod Galactus. So we already have Galactus, but here Nimrod is just an alternative win condition where instead of being one dimension, I only play Galactus, and if I don't Galactus, I lose. Now you have this Nimrod variant where you can do turn 6 Galactus pretty reliably and not be instantly doomed, because you have the procs with the Wolverine, you have the procs with the Nimrod, things like that. So it just gives Galactus an alternative win condition. Now I will say that the regular Galactus stats seem to be better. Just now, does that mean that Nimrod is making you lose more? Maybe. Like, honestly, maybe that's what it is, right? But it could also just be this is harder to play and people are making mistakes or staying in when they should leave, etc., etc. Like, there's definitely other reasons besides this being just worse that is making the stats appear that it's just worse, but it's just another way of playing Galactus. Maybe you're just bored of regular Galactus, or you want to have other ways to win if they counter you. But then again, if you are playing into the counter, then you're gonna lose anyways, right? So there is that. But overall, it's still good. The stats are still good, right? It's still tier 2, but it is noticeably different than regular Galactus that I had to move it down a tier. So if you want to play it, if you like it, feel free. Just wanted to let you know, all right? Just be honest here. Next up, we have Dracula Dump. So this one is this is definitely a cool list. I'm a big fan of Dracula as a card. Generally, when it's not being played against me, let me clarify. When I'm the one playing the card, I'm a big fan of it. Just because being able to hit like a Destroyer or a Red Skull or an Infinaut and just getting a 4 powers 20, right? It's just really, really good. So this one, you just want to have a lot of early games so that you can get those out of your hand so that you can reliably hit your more expensive cards with Dracula. And if you can do that, it's really strong, really powerful. It's not a super, super popular deck, I will say. So, but the stats for it are really good. So definitely something you can try. It's fun to play as well. So that's also a big plus, I would say. I mean, but it's pretty subjective what you find fun. So, you know, you might not like this, but overall, it's a pretty good archetype. Has good stats, and the playstyle is pretty telegraphed. And like, you do this and make sure you set up your Dracula to give you big stats. And there's a lot of cool synergies, right? You can get Destroyer out without it blowing up your whole board if you have the armor or the Cosmo or the Zero or anything like that. So. Strong, fun archetype. Next up, we have Electro. So Electro also tier 2. This used to be much higher, I would say, in terms of the meta game, but that was maybe before that was in between my tier list, right? This was like very dominating, and then they nerfed Sandman in between since it was too problematic. So it used to be a 5/5, not a 5/3. I do think because they nerfed it, tons of flood decks are now super viable, and people are just playing tons of decks that flood at the final turn. So maybe you can start running this again to kind of mess with the people that flooding. I will say that this isn't very good into Galactus, and maybe that's why people aren't playing it, right? Because the Galactus matchup is not that good. You'd have to, I don't know, you'd have to arrow them, right? To beat Galactus. Well, basically the Galactus matchup is bad, so that might be another reason people aren't playing it. But generally, if you're fighting into tons of flooding decks, then this can definitely be something to play to kind of put a cap on their sale. So still strong decks. The stats are pretty reasonable, so I don't mind you playing it. It's just like I'm just thinking about it and thinking, oh yeah, probably Galactus sucks. But that's the benefit of Galactus. There's just some decks you auto beat, and this can be one of them. So what can you do? So next up we have Moon Girl, Dino. So this is the beginning of tier 3, right? So this is where there's like a little bit of a gap in the percentages of the win rate. So these are maybe a little bit weaker, but they're not weak enough that if you want to play them, you should still play them. It's just that there's a little bit of a noticeable gap that to create a new tier for them. So here we have Moon Girl. So this is a very popular archetype. You can make it very early in your journey in Marvel Snap, right? You don't need any Series 3s really. If you want to play it, you can play with just all Series 2 cards. And you just go Moon Girl into Dino and double Dino or whatever. You can like start adding more tools if you want to add Mystique, if you want to add Agent Coulson, whatever you want, Dr. Doom, right? You can start doing more, but the general strategy is to just go rely on your Moon Girl, rely on your Devil Sword to really carry you in the games, and it's pretty good, pretty strong. Definitely think it's still good. It's obviously not broken, but it can definitely win you games. So next up we have Thanos Death. So this is a Thanos deck that does rely on blowing up your own 1-drops and then playing Death and stuff. A lot of times you end up creating Deathwave with Thanos in it, which is fine, right? Still, you're playing a powerful archetype, but you just add a Thanos in it, which can work out for you. So that's really some of the benefits of Thanos. You can play just very strong archetypes and then put Thanos in there if you want to, and it just gives you access to Reality Stone. It gives you access to Time Stone, which are just really good cards, and then some of the other Soul Stone is like pretty reasonable as well. So that kind of strategy can work out, and Death can do it. There are some weaknesses. Obviously, the draws can be really bad for you with Thanos, since you have a ton of bad draws, and people running Darkhawk also punish you. So that's something else that I guess has really put Thanos down. Not just the nerf of Lockjaw and the addition of Killmonger because of all the Nebulas and stuff like that. Also, a lot of decks just run Darkhawk now, and Darkhawk really messes with Thanos. It used to be like its hidden counter, where if you have Darkhawk, the Thanos decks just give Darkhawk extra power for no reason. So there's a lot of decks that run Darkhawk, a lot of decks right now, like almost so many decks, right? So any Thanos deck is just inherently getting beat up by Darkhawk players just because of that. So that's really hurt it, in my opinion. So those are some of the things to think about when you are creating Thanos decks, and why there's a difference, right? It's just people have more access to more tools, and some of the more common tools just counter decks intrinsically, right? So that's one for Thanos, and one that it's going to suffer a little bit with. But in those other matchups, you still have Shang-Chi, right? And in those other matchups where you're not fighting Darkhawk or whatever, you can do a lot of damage, and you're still playing Deathwave or some type of death synergistic deck, so it can definitely work out for you. So next up we have Destroyer Spectrum. So this one is definitely cool because you can play this archetype with just one Series 3 card. You just need the Destroyer. But it is not super popular, and right now it is super weak to Enchantress. So you do have to be careful. Fortunately, you can Professor X to kind of prevent that, but if they Professor X in the same lane, or in the Enchantress in the same lane of your Professor X, you don't get to do that. But if you do get the Professor X down, then you don't have to worry too much about Enchantress. But that's like maybe its biggest weakness right now. If people Enchantress your armor and you go Destroyer, well, you just blow up your whole deck, right? And you always lose. So that's like something very notable that I've seen happen to people, and it just feels horrible. So that is something you have to be aware of when the their opponent is playing a deck that normally runs Enchantress, right? You maybe have to Cosmo, right? You either have to Cosmo or Professor X so that that doesn't happen. And if you do that, then it's fine. So as long as you are paying attention and you have the counters, then you're not really gonna get hit by that. But you can definitely get wrecked if you're just being careless. So just be aware of that. But it's still good, right? Tier 3 is still very respectable in my opinion, and you have a lot of flexibility in how you approach the late game. So this is a strong deck that can work out as long as you are paying attention and feels is a fun one to play. So next up we have Thanos Control. So this one is definitely more reliant on the ability of just using Thanos with lots of other control tools, things like Professor X, things like Titania, things like Blue Marvel, things like Valkyrie. Those kind of things can really help you. And obviously, you still have some of the weaknesses that we've talked about with all the Thanos decks, with Darkhawk, Killmonger, and just general annoying archetypes that can also just match you pound for pound. But Control is a pretty robust archetype. Definitely a lot of thinking required, which also makes it a little bit worse in the stats. Any heavy thinking deck has worse stats because people are just piloting it badly. No offense. But yeah, I do think this can work out for you as long as you know what you're doing and you are aware that, okay, this is how I want to approach each matchup against my opponent. So definitely a cool one. Next up, we have Toxic Sera. So I would say this is maybe the most like overrated deck according to stats in terms of how many people play the deck, but then how many people, like what the stats showcase for the amount of people playing the deck. And I would say this one is maybe the most overhyped, and like there's tons of people playing Toxic Sera, but its stats are like tier 3 level, right? Not tier 1, which is what you would expect in terms of how many people are actually playing the archetype. Now I can understand it because it's a fun archetype to play. Hazmat is a really fun card, and it feels good to win with, and people are adding Sentry now, and Sentry's a fun card that I haven't been able to play with Sentry for a long time, and you have all these cool synergies, right? You've got the Viper synergy, the Valkyrie synergy, the Luke Cage synergy. It's I understand it for sure, but the stats aren't super favorable. Not that it's bad stats. The stats are playable, right? Solid, but normally from the amount of play rate you have for this type of archetype, you would expect maybe a little bit more percentage points in the stats. So I definitely want to say it's a good deck. Like no one's saying the deck is bad. It's just that it's not broken or anything like that in terms of the stats there. So definitely want to mention that. And here we have Thanos once again, Thanos Zoo. So this is a more aggressive version of Thanos. You're just trying to flood. You do have to be careful of Killmonger, of course, even with regular Kazoo. But Thanos just gives you access to things like Spectrum, Valkyrie, Daredevil, Professor X. You don't really get to play any of those type of cards in regular Kazoo, so you have this extra tool because your one drops give you more draw, that you get to play these more heavier cards at the end because you're going to be able to flood realistically. So pretty cool. Next up, we have Destroy Null. So this is just a variant of the Destroy archetype. Destroy by itself didn't have enough too much play, but there was a lot of Destroy with Null included. I guess people were just playing with Null since they got it or something like that. But Destroy Null also could be Deadpool. Deadpool Destroy is another name. I like the Null. I like that. But Deadpool Destroy, essentially pretty reasonable deck list, I would say. Its win rate wasn't too bad. Surprising me, I thought it would be maybe a little bit worse, but I guess it makes sense, right? Null is a good card if you can play it realistically, and you can play it pretty easily with this archetype. So as long as you get the setup here, you can definitely do a lot. And then the third one's like an old list. You don't have Null there, but you have the Taskmaster, so it's a little bit more reliant on Deadpool, but if you can get the setup, it works and feels pretty good. So that was something I wanted to go over since I thought it was pretty cool. And I don't see this deck much, right? Because they're all playing Galactus. So I don't see this deck too much, but apparently the stats say it's being played a decent amount, that it was mentionable. Now here's junk. So this is junk without Thanos. You're just annoying them with useless cards, and you fill their locations to prevent them from doing their plays. This one's definitely a little bit worse than Thanos junk. I think Thanos has more tools that they can work with to make it easier for you. But with junk, you just have to be more careful about filling your locations and making sure everything's working out. This is also a heavy thinking deck. You have to always be thinking about what your opponent wants to do, making sure you annoy them at every turn, every stage. So it can be hard to play, and I think that's probably hurting the stats. But overall, it is reasonable to play. Not super broken or anything like that, but has a lot of tools to work with to just ruin opponent's days. And this is the type of deck that can destroy Galactus, by the way, as well, right? Like can be. I hate Galactus. I'm going to ruin a Galactus player. This is the type of deck that can do that, and you might see some people playing with this just to make sure that Galactus players suffer, right? Just make sure that they suffer. You have Green Goblin, Debris, and Polaris, and Viper, right? And you don't like them at all. So definitely a fun one if you're into messing with people, for sure. Now here we have Thanos Lockjaw. I believe this is the first tier 4, right? So this is where there's a distinction. So Thanos Lockjaw used to be the best, I would say, the best archetype in the game, but then they nerfed Quinjet, which was doing a lot. They nerfed Lockjaw, which was doing a lot. Darkhawk rose in popularity, and also people just got better deck lists that can now compete, as well as Galactus is like significantly more popular, and Lockjaw doesn't really do anything to beat Galactus at all, right? Like there's not anything you're playing that really counters it. So there's just a lot of things that really hurt Lockjaw, so it's dropped down a lot. So it's not really super good. Obviously, there's still some archetypes there's still some variants of the deck list that are strong. Like this particular third list, right, is basically Lockjaw plus Deathwave plus DoomWave, right? It's got a lot of little text in there to feel really powerful, and that list does very well, but generally the Lockjaw lists aren't really doing too well overall, so I had to put it in its own little distinction there. And here, Kazoo, I do have a deck breakdown for this one. So this one is definitely significantly, this is definitely a new player, beginner friendly deck where you don't really need anything to pilot it, and you're running Khazar and Blue Marvel and then tons of 1-drops. Early on, you don't have to worry about Killmonger, but as you climb and people start playing Killmonger, then you have to worry about them using Killmonger to really destroy your 1-drop, so you have to be careful. Either you play armor or so, but a lot of times it seems that the decks that do well just don't ignore that. They just say, okay, if they have Killmonger, then I need to be behind on those final turns. And there's definitely a lot of ways you can pilot it. You can do Onslaught, you can do Hidden Monkey and Nebula if you want to make it a little bit more expensive. But overall, the stats aren't super great, right? It's tier 4, so its win rate isn't super dominating. And if your opponent's playing something super meta, it's hard to really counter or beat that. So that's maybe where it struggles a little bit. But it's a fun deck, especially something that new players have easy access to. So that's something to always be aware of, right? What decks can new players play? And this is definitely one of them. So next up, we have Attuma Control. So what is that, right? Is probably what you're asking. Well, this is a deck that just relies on using Attuma and usually Destroyer to kind of control the board. So you're running. So something is nice is that if you go to Attuma, you can Professor X and the Attuma won't die, right? You can also go armor into Attuma and it won't die. So you have two ways of getting this Attuma down, as well as just playing Attuma in its own empty lane is something you can do. But then you also have Claw, right? So you can go Claw to kind of reach and boost up the Attuma lane without having to play an extra card in there. So you just have a lot of ways to make this Attuma relevant without it messing with you too much. And that's really where the control aspect of it comes in. So I have seen people run Daredevil. Like if you don't have Jeff, you can always pretty much, and if you're running a Professor X deck without Jeff, then you can pretty much always put Daredevil in as your replacement, if that's what's missing. So you can definitely put Daredevil there, but generally this is like the meta version of the Attuma control deck, and it's a fun little deck if you like to play Attuma or you want to do something like this. And its stats are good enough to be in its own archetype, and it's also good enough to be in this tier list. So definitely something fun if you want to try it out for sure. Next up, we have classic Lockjaw. So once again, Lockjaw got nerfed. You can only trigger its effect once per turn, which is pretty important because a lot of times you would put multiple cards in there, multiple 0 cost, multiple stones in there. But now you can only do it once per turn, so it's really dropped in terms of how strong it can be. Definitely weaker after the nerf. You still can hit those big power. You can still hit the Infinaut. You can still hit Magnetos and stuff like that. But it's just not as consistent in terms of how reliable that the deck is, and from what it used to be, right? It used to be just, oh, I always just put all my weak things in there. Now you can't really do that, right? So let's say you play Jane Foster and you get the Hammer and you get the Wasp. Well, you can only swap one, right? Instead of being able to swap two. So it's not as good, but it's still playable, right? It's still in the tier list, but it's just not amazing, right? Compared to some of the other decks we've talked about. Then here we have No.Dork discard. So this is M.O.D.O.K without, this is like discard without the M.O.D.O.K, and you just don't have that big win condition, which M.O.D.O.K normally does give you. Here you have to rely on other ways to do it. So here we have Lockjaw is like the way of triggering multiple discards, since you can put the discards back into the deck and have them trigger over and over again, right? So you can like trigger Hellcow multiple times or something like that. But it's not as clean, it's not as guaranteed then, oh, I just play M.O.D.O.K and I have everything and then now I pop off, right? You have to do a little bit more work. So it's a noticeable difference, decks that have M.O.D.O.K or discard decks that have M.O.D.O.K and discard decks that don't, that I had to kind of make a different archetype for it. So definitely wanted to let you know, right? If you're like, oh, discard's great, and then you're like, I don't have M.O.D.O.K, well, I'm sorry, it's a lot worse. Well, not a lot, but like it's noticeably worse, I would say. Then next up we have Thanos Ongoing. So Ongoing is just not in the best spot, especially due to Enchantress, and the ongoing version of Thanos just has a lot of weaknesses, right? Inherent to Thanos already, but then you have this Enchantress ruining your Onslaught, ruining your Claw, ruining your Devil Sword, ruining your Marvel, like all your hits, right? If they just have Enchantress, you just get wiped, right? So it's definitely doesn't feel that good right now. It is playable and you can definitely do it, but I would recommend like a different Thanos variant, and there's a lot of ways to play Thanos, so you can definitely find something that works for you. And I would say ongoing on the back burner for now. Now here we finally have the tier 5s. So these ones have sub 50% win rates, and that's like the better decks of this archetype, right? Like I usually give you the standard decks, and I try to give you like a solid list as well, right? But even some of the solid lists are also sub 50%. So like it's like ugh, right? Heimdall move definitely at the top of this tier where we have the tech move or Magneto move, whatever. But if you don't have those type of extra tech cards, you have to be very sneaky, or you have to try lots of different things. Right here we have like Sandman as a third list. This one was like okay because Sandman can like win you a game by itself, and so that was like not bad. But generally, if you're playing Heimdall move, it's not that great. It's really not doing too much for you, and you definitely have to be careful. So not the biggest fan of any of the tier fives we're going to be talking about, but I wanted to talk about them because what I did last time was I just didn't discuss the decks that had high play rate but didn't do that well. I wanted to discuss them this time. And then here we have traditional control. So this is a control deck without Nebula, without any of the tools, the new tools that people are running. I couldn't find like a really viable one, so I had to add Doctor Doom to like make it playable here. So, but here you just don't have the new tools. So Jeff was like, okay, like the normal one is like the first list, right? Where you don't have Jeff, you don't have Nebula, you don't have anything, right? So it's just like a weaker version of Storm Control. But but the stats overall for like playing a traditional control deck, if you don't have anything fancy, is not good, right? So if you want to make it work, right, start putting Jeff in, start putting Nebula in, right, start putting Doctor Doom in, right. Those are where you really start seeing more success with it. But if you don't have anything fancy, right, like if it's just Daredevil and Professor X and there's nothing else, like there's way better decks to really work with, especially in the control. There's a lot of control in the meta game right now, so you can probably find something with some of the pieces you have that'll work for you. But overall, the stats for control not good, so I had to put it in there. Well, regular control is good, but regular control with nothing is not as good. And then here we have Cerebro 3. So Cerebro 3 definitely stat wise is not healthy, I would say. Cerebro 2 is a lot better, but Cerebro 3 is not. I think it's definitely harder to pilot, and the tools are more expensive in that you need to have this go into this, where you need Bast a lot of the time, you need Magic a lot of the time, you need Rhino usually, and you need Valkyrie sometimes to really counter some of the metagames. So these are just expensive cards that don't always like work together and make your win conditions less reliable. Where with Cerebro 2, you're just playing 2 drops, or I mean 2 power cards, and then you buff them. Like it's very simplistic. Where this one you have to kind of like, oh, when do I play Killmonger? When do I Cosmo? When do I Iron Man? When do I do blah blah blah? And it's just harder to play. So I don't think the deck is like horrible. It's just that the stats don't really uh help the case for Cerebro 3. But if you like Cerebro 3, don't let me stop you, right? And don't let the stats stop you. I definitely think if you have Jeff, right, like you can find playable versions of the deck. But if you're playing it like normally, you might struggle a little bit, is my thought. And then here we have Mr. Negative. Obviously, Negative is not the most consistent archetype. I do think Iron Lad could help it a bit though, right? So that is potentially something going for Negative, but generally right now the stats just say its win rate is pretty bad most of the time. It doesn't mean the cube rate is horrible, but when you do pop off with Negative, people leave. So it's just like either you lose or they leave, right? And that's kind of the issue. Galactus doesn't have that major problem where Negative does, where it's like, okay, you've played Negative, I guess I'm leaving, right? It is like you play Galactus, I leave, but usually you'll be able to get some value with Galactus. And there's just some matchups you're ahead if you're playing Galactus where you usually sure they can't counter you, where you can't really get that feeling with negative. So not the best deck list. And then finally, the last one here is Agatha. Woohoo, Agatha. So Agatha, I'm not really the biggest fan of. It's just like, it just plays random cards in random lanes. You can take advantage of it in some circumstances with Wave and Lady Civ and Ghost Rider and stuff like that. You can definitely take some advantage of the deck list, but normally it's not really an archetype you use to climb, right? It's something, an archetype you use to either farm boosters or let it play automatically. It's not really the best climbing archetype to play, so I'm not a big fan of it. It's definitely tier 5. I don't really recommend it if you want to climb. You can definitely try it, and some people have, but the win rates aren't looking good for you overall, even though some people argue that, you know, you can definitely do things with Agatha, but it has to be a bit unique. So those are all the archetypes we have for this meta tier list. And finally, we do have the visual, I guess, for it as well. So here we do have the visual for this if you want to kind of see quickly, oh, this goes here, this goes here. We have that tier 0, we have the tier 1, we have the tier 2, we have the tier 3, tier 4, tier 5. So hope this helps, right? If you want me to go over this, my last video basically went over this, you know, since I had this done yesterday. But here, this is the meta tier list for me. Take care of yourselves. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm really got to figure out whether I want to continue this, because this took like a week. It's just definitely so much effort. But take care of yourselves. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next one.
Educated calling snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you tomorrow, snap. Your skills will be